Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 401 of the Running Rogue podcast. This is your host, Chris McClung, back to you on the other side of 400 episodes. Here with James Dodds, excited to be talking today, back in the book, about training paces. So we are digging into some key principles to remember about both choosing and executing on training paces, so that you can target and build towards the fitness you want. I think there's a few points in here that are a little bit counterintuitive, or at least counter what people want to do. So we'll dig into that here in a second. But first, welcome James Dodds, co-host. How are you?
Doing well. Had a good run today.
Nice.
And this weekend was like, we had a ton of rain last week. So like this weekend being like 50 degrees both mornings, full sunshine, 60 degrees, 70 degree in the afternoon. It was like, I don't know. I think I'm still riding that. Just in a kind of pleasant little mood.
Man, we had some proper spring conditions this weekend for sure. Back a little bit humid this morning, but it's always easier to face that when you've had a few good days.
Yeah.
So nice. Glad you had some good runs. Thanks also to all of our listeners for the response to last week's episode. Got some emails, definitely got some nice comments. Really appreciate, especially those longtime listeners giving us kudos on episode 400. So thanks to you guys who commented and appreciated that little trip down podcast memory lane. That was fun. And thanks to you for taking me through it. But today we're back to it. We got the book in hand and going back into it. We're going to talk about basically the truths behind training paces as we dig in here. Before we do that, first I want to just remind people that we're in that season of kicking off training. Fall races are looking ahead. We've got, 20 to 25 weeks to go for a lot of those big races in the fall in October and November. A lot of those races are selling out quickly. So if you've been on the fence about choosing a fall race, I would jump on it. We're going to be in Indianapolis the second weekend in November, which is exciting. I think they only have a couple thousand spots left in the full, which will sell out quickly. But just remember, you can train with us in person. We have our kickoff here for fall training in Austin and Dallas, and our in-person locations here this weekend, Mother's Day weekend. And then we fully reset our virtual groups, all three of them here coming up in a few weeks in early June. So if you're thinking about jumping in with us, this is a perfect time to do it. So quick reminder on that. You can check out info on that at roguerunning.com, or just email us, coaching@roguerunning.com, and we'll point you in the right direction. So let's jump in on this. We're going to be talking about training paces today. How do you determine and how do you execute on training paces? When a lot of our workouts, as we know, are prescribed based on running a certain interval for a certain pace. And in the vernacular of our sport, we tend to use the race distance that we're targeting to label a training pace. So you might run 400 meter reps at 5K pace, or 800 meter reps at 5K pace, or 10K pace. You might do 2-mile reps at marathon pace. We talk in those terms, but I think it can be a little bit confusing how we label that and create some perhaps mistakes when it comes to executing on that. So we want to dig into it today and really talk to you about how do you determine those, how do you execute on them, how do you keep them in your mind in a way that's productive, that's additive to your training. And we've got 9 principles to cover here. I actually want to start kind of in the middle or later, one of the later ones on the list, which is to say, because I think this helps us with the definition, we draw a distinction between training paces and race paces. Even though we label them using race names. That, again, may be a little bit of a misnomer, but it's just the standard by which we use in this sport. But we want to draw a distinction between the two. There are training paces and there are race paces, and those two things may or may not be the same.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile that concept and explain it to people?
It's almost hard to start there and answer that without going into almost some of the bullets.
It's
But
okay.
but I would anchor on one of your key statements, in that you have to train from where you are to get to where you want to go. So training paces, meaning like your next workout, we're looking at basically where you're at currently, so point A. And we know that you have some desire to grow and get better, which is your ultimate point B. But it's like you just take the next step off of point A. And so when we think of training paces, we're like, how do we give the right physiological stimulus? And then the pace is a guide towards that stimulus, in order to basically stress you, let you heal and get better. And then you're just bumping along towards that ultimate goal, that big picture B, which will ultimately land on race paces. And even that can be a little confusing. But like your race pace is what you're going to determine and select as like, all right, if I'm racing a 5K, I think this is the best I can run at it, and you go after it, or 10K or half or full. And people might be stronger in different areas, so it can vary from race to race. Like, even if you and I, we're so drastically different on all of them, but let's say that you and I share the same 5K pace, for a 5K race, but one of us might be faster at a marathon. So there's just nuances. Some people are stronger at longer distances and everything. So your race pace is going to be determined after training and through training. That helps you pick, what do I think I can sustain for 26, 13, 10K, 5K, etc. Whereas your training is like, okay, that's what you need in order to get enough stress in the next workout, and the kind of stress based on the phase of the training we're in order to get the stimulus that we're trying to get in any given week.
Yep.
Did I make it more sloppy or?
I mean, I think we're gonna just figure it out as we go here. But the point being that you could be training at paces that might ultimately be different than what you race at. And I think there can be a lot of reasons for that. The core one is that, and it really goes back to kind of our point one on the day, which is that training pace is a proxy. We're using it as a way to triangulate around an effort zone. An effort is king. That's what we're trying to achieve in a workout in order to get a certain stimulus so that we can build fitness in a certain way, depending on what we're trying to do. And we use pace to help us figure out, am I at the right effort? But there's, for a lot of reasons, why sometimes pace isn't the best indicator of effort, which we'll cover. So it's a way, essentially, to help you get to the right effort zones in training, but that may or may not directly correlate to what you can do on race day, for a variety of reasons. You mentioned one, which is kind of this idea of you might have different skill sets. Some people are better at the shorter stuff. Some people are better at the long stuff. Might also vary what you're training for. If you're training specifically for a marathon, you may or may not be able to run your 5K training pace in a race during that same cycle, because you've been skewing your training towards the longer stuff. The weather has a factor, which we're going to cover. There's also, when you get to the race itself, you might, for various reasons, be more aggressive or less aggressive, depending on what you're trying to accomplish for the day, or weather on the day, or the terrain of the course might dictate a certain thing. And so it's kind of like, I like to talk about the idea that, you got to focus on the inputs rather than the outputs to get where you want to go. And the question is, what are the right inputs? And pace isn't really an input. It is a way, effort is more the input, and pace is just a way to corroborate that. And it's actually ends up being more of an output than anything else. So yes, we may have muddied the waters, but we're digging into it, and we're just trying to explain the fact that it's a little less straightforward than we'd liked it to be. And so now let's take it back to the top, which is that pace is simply a proxy for effort. Effort is actually what you're trying to achieve. And so you have to keep that in mind. Pace is just an input, not an input. Pace is just a way to corroborate around the effort. And just like heart rate is, just like how you feel perceived effort is, there are a lot of ways to triangulate around being in the right spot for a workout. And the one that we use most commonly because it's easiest is pace.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is huge. I'm just thinking for what it's worth because I think athletes, in the desire to do a good job, want to make it absolutely black and white. And I think as coaches, in the spirit of making life easy, we would prefer that it be black and white as well. But as we'll get into, there's so many circumstances surrounding what might happen in a workout that driving home this idea of effort being king and effort being the real input, whereas pace is an indicator of effort that day. Yeah, not. I know we've done this a few times where we've said this is the most important episode, but I do think that this is one that people can chew on quite frequently because it shows up in so much of training.
Yeah, and it's, again, I think it covers a realm that's kind of easier said than done. I mean, this is where we get into, we talk about the karate belts, when you're
Mhm.
kind of developing in your running journey, going from, the white belt all the way up to the black belt, and understanding the nuance of how pace is used is a part of the journey to the black belt.
Mhm.
The ultimate black belt is not needing pace at all, right? In a sense, like you could just say, all right, James, I want you to go out in a certain effort, and this is the effort we're trying to achieve for the day. And you could just do it without needing pace or needing heart rate or anything else. You can just do it by how you feel.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the ultimate. But because it's helpful to have things to triangulate around, we use pace as one of those things.
Yeah.
But don't ever forget that pace is just a proxy for effort. It's not the end all and be all. And there's a lot of reasons why, just to give specific examples, where a given workout where a certain pace or effort is assigned could give you a completely different result on a different day if you just arbitrarily stick to one given pace.
Mm-hmm.
Today, here in Austin, Texas, is a perfect example. Hot, humid morning. You might have a workout where, quote, 5K pace, 10K pace, half marathon pace is prescribed. But if you pedantically stick to that on a hot, humid morning, you're probably at an effort that's too high for the intended goal of the workout. You have to actually adjust to a slower pace to keep that effort in the right zone to get the stimulus we're trying to achieve. And so, but you compare this same kind of workout on a day in January where the temperatures are perfect and the pace, a faster pace might actually be the right prescribed effort to get you the right stimulus, where a slower one is needed today. So it's, again, hard to compare completely apples to apples, just knowing that there's a lot of variables that are going to that's going to affect how you feel on a given day, and you have to make sure you're accounting for those while using pace as one variable you consider.
Yeah. It brings up a couple of things for me. One, to remind people, environment is a stimulus. So like, i.e., like if it's warm, or like you said, if it's humid, are you going uphill versus flat versus downhill? Yeah, so there's a lot going on environment, but it's in some ways I keep getting these trail images, and so I'm just going to go with it. And it's like, one, I think trail runners kind of get this a little more. Like if you're talking to a trail runner, especially ultra runners, and you're comparing 50K times, it's just sort of known. Like once you've stepped into this world, you know it. Like no one debates down to the second, like my 50K time is better than yours. What they'll do is they'll be like, oh, where was that? How much vert was in it? Like when you're comparing times with a fellow trail runner, you just naturally are going to be like, give me a little. They may not use this technical language. They may not say, what was the environmental stimulus of your 50K? But they're going to dig into vert, basically. They're going to be like, vert, interesting. That altitude, took you 6 hours.
Technical, not technical. A lot of variables.
Exactly. Yeah.
And yeah, you can't compare 150K to the next in a trail race.
Yeah.
And yeah, we try to do that here. And again, I understand why, because the road is a more precise or an environment that requires a little more precision when you're trying to target specific times, but sometimes that can be misleading.
Mm-hmm.
And so point one here is just that global point to say, hey, just remember that when you're using pace, it's just a proxy for effort. And always ask yourself, especially when there's other variables at play, what's the effort I'm trying to achieve? And what might that mean about my pace
Mm-hmm.
on a given day? Because if you just blindly stick to your target pace, you might be doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the examples I like to use, you give the trail example, I give sort of the altitude example. Whenever you're at 9,000 feet and you have to go slower because the air is thinner up there, no one really questions it. You're like, oh, yeah, of course I have to slow down. I'm at 9,000 feet. And we just accept that without thinking about it and, adjust off of our normal paces accordingly. But in warm weather or in humid weather, we don't always give ourselves the same grace for whatever reason. We want to sort of just, again, stick to that target and think we failed if we didn't hit it, even though the weather's telling us shouldn't be possible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's point one here. Pace is a proxy for effort. Don't ever forget that. And let the effort still reign depending on your conditions. Point two, related, is pace is not a definitive measure of success in training. It's not a definitive measure of success in training. And I want to say, not just for workouts, but for anything. One of the things as a coach that would be a pet peeve, you could say, is when I hear people talking about defining success in an easy run based on pace. Where they say, well, I ran faster this week on my long run than I did last week on a similar distance long run. So that must be better, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not, in fact. So, we can't use pace really ever unless it's slow enough, unless we're comparing slower times as a definitive measure of success on easy days, because there truly effort is king. And then when it comes to workouts, as we've already talked about, there might be reasons, altitude, weather, terrain, hills, not hills, where pace is going to be different at similar efforts because of those other variables. And so we can't just lock in on that as the measure of success, or we're missing the point.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of the idea of, and we've said this before, I think on this podcast, definitely within the virtual groups, but it's like, it's a good reminder that training is there for development. Back to your idea of inputs, like you're inputting something, you're doing something to your body in order to get a result later down the road. So like training is there. It's almost good to just prime your mind with this before workouts. Training's there for development. It's not there for affirmation. And don't get me wrong, I actually believe in affirmation, and I'm a positive oriented. We both are. We encourage our athletes. Like encouragement is part of the process, but we just don't want pace becoming the thing that, as athletes, you're sitting alone and looking at your watch and you're like, cool, finally, evidence I'm good enough, or evidence I'm getting better. Or it's like, it's hard to break away from that, because usually when we see PRs on the clock, we celebrate that. And so we get that ultimate sign of progression and getting better. But training, we don't want to bring that to training. Like, ooh, I got affirmation because finally I'm running X pace in a workout. It's like, those are just.
Yeah. Did you achieve the purpose of the workout globally?
That's the real question.
Did you hit certain paces?
Yeah.
And by the way, a related point here from a race pace perspective is that time isn't the only variable that matters in terms of defining success on race day. Again, weather, terrain, rain, whatever it may be, those are all variables that might affect your ability to run a time trial at a certain target. And the black belt is going to consider those variables when evaluating success or failure.
Mm-hmm.
Same is true for training and workouts. So that's point two. I think we've beat that horse dead. Point three, as we get into the more practical elements here, is that training paces, and we do believe you should determine them, but they should be determined by more than one factor. We like to triangulate generally around 3 different factors or inputs when it comes to determining what should be your target training paces. And those tend to be time trials, right? Which would be often our favorite distance time trial. 2-mile time trial is a great training input that can help you determine where you are and what training paces should be, because you can use that. It's essentially a VO2 max test that you can use to extrapolate to other distances for training pace perspective. Race results is another key input. If you've got recent race results at any distance, it's going to tell you what's possible from a training pace perspective. And then ultimately how you're feeling in workouts at similar paces is also going to be the other input. And between those 3 things, you're kind of saying, all right, what is this triangulating around? And I think there's a little bit of a misconception that there's some sort of precision happening here. And you make your best attempt to get honed in on these things, but then you got to try them on for size. You got to see how they feel. Do the efforts you're trying to achieve correlate with the paces you're using, assuming consistent weather patterns? If so, then okay, we're on to something. Maybe these are paces that we can lock into. And there's actually a 4th variable I didn't even mention originally, which is your goals. What are you trying to achieve? But those variables all triangulate around you creating this list of training paces, and then you got to try those on for size and see how they go. And if you're able to run them at the right efforts, given consistent weather patterns, then great, you're on to something. If not, then you have to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's all of those variables. It's not one single variable.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have much to add there, except for, I don't think I have a lot to add there.
Yeah, fair enough. And one thing I would say, kind of mentioning the goal part, is I think there are some people that get short-sighted in a sense that they have a particular goal in mind,
mm-hmm.
and that goal is faster than they've run before. Again, depending whatever the distance, and they say, okay, well that's my goal, so therefore my training paces should be in line with that goal,
mm-hmm.
and then correlate up and down the spectrum based on that goal. And that's not necessarily the right approach.
Yeah.
Because if you're not fit enough to be in the right effort zones for those target times, then you're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you want to, as we'll talk about here in a second, perfect segue perhaps, train where you are to get where you're going,
mm-hmm.
versus train where you're going to try to get where you're going. And that is a distinct decision-making point that I cannot underscore enough.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, in fact, that most people, how do I want to phrase this? I think often people are overreaching from a training pace perspective because they're looking ahead to that next pace line that correlates with their next set of goals, but they're not actually ready
mm-hmm.
to do those paces at the right effort zones. And again, it's a counterintuitive principle, but it's our next one, which is that you got to train where you are with your current fitness to get to that next level.
Mm-hmm.
And so the times I see people have breakthroughs is when they're really patient about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gotten to a point now where with athletes, I want to see them running their current paces with the appropriately correlated efforts at heart rates, or at least perceived effort, that are below where they should be, meaning they're easier than they should be, before I graduate them to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And when people do that, I also often see them when they have that patience, I often see them have breakthroughs in races to get to that next level naturally without having to force it or overreach. And that's really hard to do. It's really counterintuitive, but trust me, it works.
I was just thinking it's also hard to trust. And I think the advantage we have here is not that we're like so smart or something, but it's just because we're in the coach's seat, we actually get to witness it so dang much that the pattern actually jumps out at you. It's like those who train slightly conservative And I'm not saying they're lazy and they don't take it serious. They're like routine driven, up and at it, like they're getting everything done. They're very serious about being committed. They're very committed, but they just have that wisdom of like, when in doubt, I'm not going to like bury myself because I actually know my routine. I need to show up tomorrow and again and again and again and again and again. And so their ability to keep themselves healthy for that whole block and stay within those windows, like we just get to witness it. Those that play it that way typically will have like some kind of cool special breakthrough on race day. Whereas the reverse, I'm glad you use this as a segue because I was thinking these were interconnected anyway. That's how I remember going through this, and I watch it happen every now and then. Someone new, and I try to work with them and talk to them and hint at it and let them massage them into the fold, so to speak. But it's like every now and then you just catch someone that's sort of like, all right, sweet, I'm gonna run sub 3, and let's say they're currently a 3:42 marathoner, and they've got the potential. Maybe they've run some super fast 5K, but thus far their marathon's like at 3:42. They'll just want to just like lock in on, okay, what is sub 3 pace? Google it. All right, that's a 6:52. Okay, I'm just gonna practice running that 6:50 pace as much as I can. And they go out and they do mile repeats, or they'll do like 2-mile repeats at 6:50, and they're just getting used to 6:50 pace. And it's like, okay, I see how you jumped and made that dot, but you got to trust us on this because one, we've seen the pattern, and two, in order to defend this, you'd have to listen to every chapter that we've just talked about building up, and it has all to do with like the way this all works and building the aerobic engine, etc. But
yeah, we're running efforts to build fitness, and if you're overreaching on those efforts because your paces are too fast, then you're not optimizing your fitness building. And so it's kind of like that scene at the end of the first Star Wars where they're trying to destroy the Death Star, and Luke is flying the ship and he's got to shoot right into the hole, and the guy's like, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. He's waiting for that perfect moment to unleash the fireball into the Death Star so that it goes right to the middle and destroys it. And that's the same thing here. It's like patience, wait for it. When in doubt, generally with training paces, stay on the conservative end of things, because it's more than likely, even though it feels like it's a slower process, it's more than likely going to get you where you want to go faster. Again, counterintuitive point, but one that we've seen time and time again in training. So just be patient, train where you are to get where you want to go. And we'll cover this again later, but what that means also is that if you've been away from training for a bit, or you had an injury and you're kind of rebuilding and you're starting from behind where you were previously for whatever reason, that means you got to go back. You got to go back to where you are and not where you used to be in order to get back to where you used to be and then beyond. And I think that can sometimes be a hard pill for people to swallow. It's like, wait a minute, you're telling me I got to go slower now, even though, because of this time off? I'm like, yeah, you do. You do. Doesn't mean you're not going to get there. But for now, while we're building, we got to slow it down again. So train where you are to get where you're wanting to go. That's principle number 4 on our list, the 5th one we're covering today. Then the next one is, you really, we always have this idea of precision with paces. My 5K pace is 7 minutes, when really you're working within a range. So we encourage people to work within a range around those paces, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, usually a 5 to 10 second range on either side of those targets, because that allows you, one, to recognize the reality that efforts are achieved in a range. They're not achieved with a pinpoint pace. If I run 7:01, does that mean I screwed up? If I run 6:59, does that mean I screwed up? If my 5K pace is 7 minutes, no. You're in the range. You're good. The effort's fine, regardless of whether you're in one or the other. But also, if you operate within a range, it allows you to mental freedom to say, hey, as long as I'm in the range, that's success. And on a warmer weather day, if I'm on the slower end of that range, perfect. If it's a cool day and I'm feeling spry and the efforts are right, and might be a little bit on the faster end of the range. And so work within a range, and that really helps, I think, open up the aperture, so to speak, for what is success when it comes to these training paces.
Mm-hmm. And for what it's worth, I'll just respond here with like how we do it practically in our groups. Like in our system, we have a training pace chart, and we use the 2 mile time trial or a recent 5K to get predictions, which tell us, like you said, the consulting language directionally where you should be. And then let's say it spits out that your MGP is an 8-minute mile. And so you're on the 3:30 pace row. And so it has a row, and we always have our athletes use 3 total rows, one a little bit faster, one a little bit slower. So I just wanted to throw out something practical in case someone was thinking like, how do I apply that? I understand the general concept, but that's the way we do it here.
Yeah.
Practically.
Yeah, we call it the kind of the 3-pace range approach. And, if your marathon pace is 8-minute miles, that's a 3:30. You might train within the range of a 3:25 and a 3:35 on either side. And anything within those ranges up and down the spectrum is success. So I think it helps give you freedom within the framework, freedom to shift depending on conditions, a broader approach to defining success, and just, again, I think reinforces that mentality that it's not a single pace that we're trying to achieve to get success in a given workout. So that's point 5, work within a range. Point 6, you got to adjust for the conditions. We've already talked about this significantly, but we'll hammer it again. Altitude, heat, extreme cold, humidity, wind, all of these things are going to have bigger than you think impacts on your pace, and you just have to adjust for them. Mm-hmm. So yes, you have to adjust for the conditions, wind, rain, heat, humidity, all the factors, especially on the extreme ends. They're going to have a bigger effect on pace than you think, and you have to make those adjustments. So yes, pace is a part of the equation, but you want to look at those other variables and make reasonable adjustments accordingly. Mm-hmm. And those adjustments are usually a little bit bigger than you think. Like a humid morning like we had in Austin today, where it was mid 70s and probably 85-90% humidity. That's going to be an adjustment factor of 20 to 30 seconds per mile to get similar efforts. And oftentimes people aren't thinking in those kinds of magnitudes when they make their adjustments, but that is the reality.
Mm-hmm. Made me think of 2 things. One, I don't use this in a technical, like, I want you to adjust by X amount of minutes, but again, just to get athletes' minds right, I get them to combine humidity and temperature together for a total number, just to understand the rigor of the environmental stimulus. So again, I'm not getting super detailed. I'll just use that. And my athletes that I train locally know, I'll just point it out. Like, for example, if it's 85 degrees outside, and typically you're thinking that's way better than 95, right? Like, that's just straight, simple math. But if it's 85 with 80% humidity, then that's a total rigor score of 165. And I'm saying, hey, look at that 165. Now, if it's 95 degrees out and it's 45% humidity, well, that's a total of 140. And so again, like at like quick glance, you're like 95 must be way worse. And it's like, well, no, technically, if you look at that other one, sometimes those 85 with 80% humidity jump up and bite you. And that's because I like quoting, you put this in the book too, so it's like, we'll connect it to an earlier part. You said sometimes people respond to altitude, but they won't consider it for these. And I got this from Magnus, but he said heat and humidity are like the poor man's altitude training, because when pro athletes go and train at altitude, they know that they're depriving their bodies of oxygen and therefore training harder. And so they get that stimulus and then they go race better, right? Well, those dealing with heat and humidity, it's the same thing, because there's blood flow that otherwise would be going to your working muscles. But now, because you're so hot and it's super humid, sweat is our cooling mechanism. And so when it evaporates, we cool off. But if it's humid, it doesn't evaporate. So now it's like a wet blanket sitting on us.
Yep.
And so that's why that total rigor score starts to matter. You're like, oh man, like I love the attitude and outlook mentally of mind over matter. But matter matters sometimes.
Yep.
So I got long-winded.
Yeah. We'll call this the James Heat Indicator Score. But you're right, because that's sort of the difference between a morning in Austin in the summer and maybe an evening in Austin in the summer, where the morning has the high humidity but lower temperatures, and the evenings have the lower humidity but higher temperatures. Sometimes those evening runs, even though the absolute temperature is higher, are easier because it's lower humidity. So, yeah, but just factor those things in, consider it, and give yourself grace. And, sometimes people tell me, well, it's just an excuse. That's just humidity is just an excuse. I'm like, no, it's a reason. There's a difference between reasons and excuses. And when it comes to reasons, we make the adjustments appropriately so that we're not overworking what we should. So point 6, adjust for conditions, which gets us back to point 7. Training paces are not necessarily equal to race paces. Sometimes they are, but they're not always. And because, by the way, you might sometimes choose to race faster than your training paces. Sometimes you might choose to race slower than your training paces. So you might go up or down depending on the various things, and also depending on how aggressive you want to be, what you're trying to achieve, what your specific goals are, how things have gone at those training paces. So there's a lot of reasons why you might choose a race pace that's different, but just disconnect those two things in your mind, especially when it comes to race time, so that you can independently ask yourself, okay, what should I be shooting for on the race day? Point 8, paces might vary within and across cycles. And this is just to acknowledge the fact that these training paces are going to naturally evolve, ebb and flow. And that could be for various reasons. I think a lot of times people think of the reasons why they might get faster during or across cycles because you're getting fitter, you're adapting, you're getting to a point where you can run at easier effort at a given pace. So you're like, okay, now I can actually up the pace to be at the appropriate effort. And that's going to be a natural progression associated with building fitness. But they might also vary in a different way. For example, there's a lot of people that I'm coaching now that have training paces that are defined by winter and spring conditions. Well, as we move into the throes of the summer, they might have to adjust those to slower paces. They might actually be, if adjusting for conditions, faster, but they're going to look slower on paper because they're making the appropriate adjustments for the heat. And that's from recovery runs to easy runs to all of your workout paces. And so, or you might have an injury where you have to pull back a little bit and you have 2 or 3 weeks where your training is disrupted, and then you're coming off of that, and you might choose to back off of those original paces so that while you rebuild the routine, you're not overdoing it. So there's a lot of reasons why things might ebb and flow, but just recognize that that's a part of it. That's okay. It's normal for that to happen. And don't just, hope, as we say in our last point, that everything's just up and to the right.
Yeah. I think of it, I'm just thinking of just more examples. Like you said, you break up the year. There's also some positive sides. Like, one is like, some may just be getting way fitter through the season. And so it's starting to even, they are getting faster and things are starting to feel easier. Others, like depending on when they train, like sometimes we have people that do like a November or a December race down here in the South, like in Texas. And it's like what the paces they were starting in August and early September when it was crazy hot, but temperatures changing. So again, examples where it almost like looked better. And then of course the reverse, keeping that in mind, is stuff we just hit on, like when things get hotter or more humid, etc. So there's so many. There's also like how you feel in a first up week versus a second up week, or even sometimes in the down week, right? We talked about the anatomy of the down week a couple weeks ago, and it's like one of the points was they don't always feel good. And so your 5K pace that week, while the reps are shorter, you may, quote, feel on top of it just because they're shorter. But you know, like there may be weeks in a down week where you just got slapped in the face twice in a row towards the end of the aerobic strength phase. And so that coming down week after 2 up weeks, you're like, I could never reach 5K pace. And it's, as a coach, we'd whisper, well, are you on the right effort as you're doing these 200s? And it's
Right.
so there's just so many random variables that come into play.
Plus, ultimately, as a coach, I want to see a trend line. It's not one workout where everything's going perfectly and your effort is lower than it should be at given paces. It's a month of workouts that look like that before you take that next step forward. So it's building the data points to say, all right, it's time to take the step forward. Or sometimes, as we like to say, you got to detrain to retrain. So when you're re-entering a cycle, you naturally pull back and want to start a little slower than perhaps you were doing at the end of the last cycle, so that you can rebuild fitness in a way that's safe and comfortable, and then it progresses from there. So you just have to stay present, be honest with yourself about where you are. Don't take leaps from one workout, get a line established, several data points before you make the adjustments up or down, and be okay with that. That's a part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
Our last point just kind of reinforces this one, which is that training paces are not necessarily linear. It's not always up and to the right, even though we want them to be. And that is okay. And it's a normal part of the process. It's a normal part of the ebb and flow of racing. It's the normal part of the ebb and flow of training, of getting injured and building back, or whatever those cycles might look like for you. And embrace that part of it, because it's a journey.
Mm-hmm.
And the journey is where you're learning. I mean, especially when you get to the edge of your potential, and that's where I've been living for a long time, there's often times where you're starting a cycle slower than where you were before from a training pace perspective. And that's just normal.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to be okay with that, because it's about, again, if you're a black belt level runner, it's about, am I hitting the efforts that I should be in order to take whatever next step forward? And you have to be okay with being honest with yourself about where you are,
Mm-hmm.
and what that means about where you want to go. And if at any point you're overreaching, you're not doing it the right way. So kind of reinforcing that point, be present, train where you are to get where you want to go. And that's not always up and to the right, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I think these are interconnected. So it's like, you were talking about it's not linear, and sometimes you just have to accept that. And it's like, in the spirit of accepting it, go back to bullet 2. It's like, that's why this is not a definitive measure of success. It's not affirmation. It's just, I feel like almost in a sense what we're doing, we in this conversation as well as in this chapter, even though we're talking about quite a lot of specifics and trying to exhaust our perspective on training paces and how to come at them, ultimately what I think we're doing is untying a knot, and that's that knot of belief of like that it's black and white, and if I want to run a sub 3, then I do this X pace as much as I can, or if I want to run a sub 4, then I run this pace. It's like, if a listener has that in their mind, I hope they can go slow with this conversation and see just how many different angles we're coming at it, to explain why it's not so dry cut, black and white, but there's a lot of gray when it comes to training paces.
Pace is not the end all and be all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. That's a part of it. Embrace it, enjoy it, think long term, be present with where you are. All of those things apply here. But yeah, 9 points to essentially boil it down to that, to that main overarching summary. What would you say to that person who's struggling with this idea, who wants the pace to mean something every time?
I would say that one, this is a long game, and the fact that we're called an endurance sport, that I can lean that direction, right? So I try to remind them of the long journey, and that this is a whole process. Like, everything about training is like a recipe, and you're cooking something for a process. So one, give it time. You're checking in too much. A watched pot never boils. I go back to old old little quotes from life. Um, and then I also try, so I would hit them like in an emotional nurturing type way from that perspective. Like, hey, you're over checking. You're trying to see the finished product too soon. A watch pot never boils. So that gets them into a little bit of a relaxed conversational. Like, hey, I'm a human. He's a human. We can both relate to that concept. And then I try to swing over and get them back into the investment minded perspective. So putting the right inputs in. And it's like with money, it's always easy. Like anybody that has a little more money today than they did yesterday, they're not a party pooper. They're not sad, right? And so if you can get people seeing through the lens of additive, like, are we getting better? Like, you were here yesterday and you're now here, like you're progressing, you're moving forward. Do you want to kill that momentum? No. Okay, then don't overtrain. Let's keep adding to the fitness that you have. And so whether you use a financial metaphor or not, that's not important. But I think anchoring in that idea of like, all right, I know where you want to be and I know where you are, and we want like more fitness is part of the goal, right? And they're like, yeah, okay. So it's like, okay, let's not get crazy. To your word, be present. And how do we add to the current fitness that you have? Because if you spend every single week adding to the fitness gains, even if the numbers aren't quite where you want them to yet, and maybe you're not 100% sure that you'll hit that next big BQ or goal or whatever, it's sort of like, well, we've added and added and added. And if you're building fitness perpetually, one, it's hard to get discouraged. And two, you're probably in the long run going to get, it's classic tortoise and hare. You get to where you're wanting to go faster.
Yep. Yeah. And the kind of crux of that to me, I always remind people is like, well, are we trying to win the workout or are we trying to race a certain
win the
goal,
race?
right?
Yeah.
Are we trying to win the workout? Because I think some of it is about that, where we're trying to win the workout, or whatever that means. I'm not necessarily beating people in the workout, but you're trying to make the workout look perfect on paper, make the workout look perfect on Strava, make those around you say, "Oh, that was an amazing workout." It's like, no, like that's not the goal. The goal is to get the stimulus from it that can then lead us to the goal that we want. And so what do we care about? Are we trying to win the workout, or are we trying to win the proverbial race? So that's something to keep in mind. Well, I think we can tie a bow on this one. We've talked about this one every potential way that you can. And I'll just leave you with this reminder. Just training paces are a helpful tool. They are just that. They are a tool. And don't let them become more than they are. And this episode, I think, captures all the reasons why they're just a tool. So with that, we can wrap it up. Again, as a reminder, you can check out our training options at roguerunning.com or email us, coaching@roguerunning.com. Also, as a reminder, on Fridays at 2 p.m. Central Time, James and I get on Instagram Live and do a Q&A at Rogue Running Instagram. So check that out. If you have questions about this episode, about your training paces, or about anything, we're on there answering great questions every single week from listeners like you. And with that, I think we'll wrap this one. Check us out there at Rogue Running and at roguerunning.com, and we'll talk to you next week.